The Interior Department posted a revised scientific integrity policy last month. It requires each component agency to appoint a career staff person as a scientific integrity officer. But to one group of scientists, the policy differs little from protections that were greatly weakened during the Obama administration. We get more now from Jeff Rook of the Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility. Jeff, good to have you back.
Hi there. Thank you.
Well, tell us about this policy, what caught your eye, and what the objection to peer is of it.
Well, so this is an effort that was launched by President Biden shortly after his inauguration to toughen scientific integrity policies after the Trump administration. And for the most part, agencies have been left to fashion their own policies, and they've done so in a way that protects their own managers and political appointees from having to be named as violators or suffer any consequence as a result. It's more scientific impunity policy more than a scientific integrity policy.
Tell us about the Interior posting.
Well, one of the things that was notable about it is that it appeared right before Labor Day with no public notice or comment. It was developed in secret, which is hardly a recipe for ensuring public trust. It builds on another policy that they did 10 years ago, where when they originally got into this work in 2011, they had a fairly strong policy that impaneled independent experts to review scientific integrity complaints. That resulted in findings naming managers. And that resulted in Interior, right before Christmas of 2014, gutting that policy and instead coming up with this current formula that they've just repeated. And so the nature of it is they have one hand-picked person who can determine whether something will be investigated or not. And if they decide it's not worthy of investigation, there's no review and there's no appeal. If there is an investigation, that person does the investigation with no protocol, no outside procedure. It's basically a star chamber that's done in secret. And then the results are only reported after the fact in an annual report that's summarized to the point where the substance is, in the words of the policy, anonymized, which is not a word that is meant to foster scientific integrity. In addition, the review panel, whoever does the review, is forbidden by the policy from making any recommendation of disciplinary action against a manager found to be responsible. And further, no report can be issued without the approval of the Interior Solicitor's Office, which is sort of like having the Corporate Defense Council approve all pollution enforcement. So you put it all together, and this is all about self-protection. And part of also what was done in secret was some other agencies asked their own scientists what was needed. Interior didn't do that. They didn't ask the public, and instead they have done something that's really designed to protect themselves.
And just maybe back up for a moment, if you wouldn't. What does a violation of scientific integrity look like? What forms can it take in a federal setting?
For example, suppression of research, preventing it from being published, or altering research results, or removing key findings, or otherwise sort of manipulating things. So, for example, and these policies were inspired by the W. Bush administration when they were rewriting reports to remove any reference to climate change, or they were taking endangered species recommendations and taking out the conclusions. Those scandals resulted in President Obama declaring that there should be some sort of federal policy. The old saying that everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but not to their own set of facts. In fact, federal agencies are entitled to their own set of facts. When the Bush people were asked why they did this, they said, well, because we could. There's no rule against it, and they viewed their rule as leavening science with policy considerations. So the official policy since then has been, no, these scientific results are not supposed to be edited to make sure that they only support the political talking points. They're supposed to come out regardless of their policy implications. And the nature of that mandate goes against ingrained bureaucratic tendencies, and that is what is playing out again today.
We're speaking with Jeff Rook. He is the Pacific Director for Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, known as PEER. And what would a good policy look like? I mean, what are the components of a policy you feel would protect scientific integrity?
Well, actually, the original Interior policy adopted in 2011 had a lot of good elements, and there are some good elements in the policy that NOAA has, which is that the decision whether to accept an investigation is subject to a review and appeal. And when there is an investigation, there are rules that govern it, and that the fact finders are independent experts, because in many instances, these are technical disputes that require some expertise in order to fairly judge them, and that those findings then are made public. And one of the things about this Interior policy is they're saying that everything has to be held confidential, but there's no legal justification for that. So we have had to go to the Freedom of Information Act, in some instances, litigation in order to obtain these sort of things. So an agency declaring these findings are confidential with no legal justification suggests an ulterior motive that is unbefitting Interior.
Therefore, yes, so the 2011 policy made it a public event, and everyone could see the results, and the research itself that was being questioned or not questioned was also available as part of the mix of what people could see.
And when scientists began winning those cases and managers were named, Interior decision makers decided that was an intolerable result. And so they gutted the policy, as I said, right before Christmas, again with no public notice or comment. And since then, no senior manager or political appointee in the Department of Interior has been tagged for a scientific integrity violation. And under this new policy, which went into effect before it was even announced, it's been in effect since August 20th, we don't think anyone will be held to account. One of the other experiences we've had is that the scientific integrity officer is a senior civil servant, and they have no particular protection. We represented one of the scientific integrity officers who himself pursued a complaint. This is during the Obama administration, and he was abruptly fired. Point of that is that mid-level officials who undertake inquiries that embarrass their own agency are then required to cast a profile in courage, and is done without any sort of protection for them or any sort of independent review to back them up. And so all the career incentives, and this is the common result we have, is a well-documented complaint is filed and it's deemed not worthy of investigation, end of case. And that's laughable as the basis of a scientific integrity policy.
Are there any other departments that have come up with policies under the Biden administration instructions that seem more complete to you?
NOAA is a very good example, a
Right.
sister agency, but in a different department. They also use the independent panels to do reviews. Our chief complaint about the NOAA policy, which is one that's shared by Interior, is NOAA wants to keep everything confidential. And we think that this confidentiality is anathema to the purpose of these policies, which is to restore public trust. You can't restore public trust from a black box. And unless there are kind of open debates about what is going on, which really sort of the nature of the scientific process, it really is more of a shuck and jive than a scientific integrity review.
What about EPA? That's always been kind of a crucible for these things as parties come and go in the White House.
EPA's new policy, this new generation under Biden is still kind of stuck in limbo. And the reason I chuckled is that they say that they have the strongest policy, but it's really by far one of the weakest. So, for example, EPA has no rules governing whether something will be investigated. And so as a result, nothing is investigated. So all during the Trump administration, there were many complaints, but not one of them was investigated. There's no requirement that they be investigated, and there's nothing that governs how the investigation is conducted. Further, EPA takes the position that a violation of the scientific integrity policy does not result in any kind of discipline or punishment. They're saying that's not in our lane. So as a result, it remains a policy without any kind of enforcement, and a policy without enforcement is more of a suggestion than a policy.
Well, now we're about to have a change in administration. We don't know who it's going to be. Sounds like you're going to keep pressing on this issue regardless.
One key flaw that both Obama and Biden made that we hope is not repeated is leaving it up to each agency to decide how the integrity of their own work is judged is a fool's errand. It's bound to failure. And there's no reason why you wouldn't have uniform rules that are federal-wide that, for example, govern when something can be approved for peer review, and if it's denied, how that appeal takes place, how investigations are done. And frankly, investigations would be improved if you had experts from other agencies look in rather than have everything confined to people who are answering the chain of command that they're judging. And that a lot of this material that we're talking about be part of an administrative record that's readily apparent. So one of the very few new things in new Interior policy is authorizing employees to file differing scientific opinions, quote unquote. However, there's no procedure for filing them, who they're filed with, what the impact is. Moreover, there's no legal protection for a scientist who gets professional blowback for filing a differing scientific opinion. So they do so at their own risk, but it's sort of this mixed message that's inherent throughout this policy, which is scientific integrity is fine so long as you don't exercise it.
Well, we'll see what happens in the next administration, because it sounds like things are kind of stasis right now.
A lot more work to do.
Jeff Rook is the Pacific Director for Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility. Peer, thanks so much for joining me.